Greetings, colleagues, fellow teachers and educators around the world. I am Nikos Ifakis. On today's Everything English Language Teaching, we take a look at an important part of our everyday life as teachers, textbooks. And we are posing the question, do we need them? Why ask this question in the first place? Well, textbooks play a central role in the English class. We all know this. We also know that they tend to dominate in certain cases and to a large extent control what is going on in the classroom. What has brought about this situation? To answer the question, we have to go back to the beginning of the very notion of education. You see, there are three types of education: formal, non-formal, and informal. Formal education includes all the types of organized and prescribed education that takes place in schools, universities, and such institutions. One of the characteristics of formal education is that it is subject-oriented. In other words, it is divided into different classes where the teaching of a particular subject, or combination of subjects even, is taught. The aim, or one of the aims, of formal education is to offer successful graduates a certificate or a degree that validates the entire program attended. Now, as we all know, the very nature of this type of education goes hand in hand with the notion of a textbook. Because what do textbooks offer? Textbooks are subject-oriented. They're divided into sections which make monitoring of the progress of learning possible. And typically, the end of a textbook signifies the end of the program, typically. In other words, textbooks are a basic, indispensable feature of formal education. Now, of course, there are other types of education as well. What makes these types different is not how seriously they treat teaching and learning. What makes them different is the way they are structured, how they treat accreditation, and how they are perceived by us all. Thus, non-formal education programs are more practice-oriented, more diversified, more directed towards engaging participants and more interested in meeting individual students' needs. Take, for example, conference-style workshops or community-based sports programs. And informal education is even less statutory. It is entirely based on experience and it spreads throughout the life cycle of a person. One final tiny detail that distinguishes these three types of education is cost. Formal education is typically costly in terms of money. Non-formal education is typically cheaper, and of course, informal education is practically free. It can be easily surmised that textbooks play a far less central role in non-formal education settings, and that they are entirely absent from informal education. So, this gives us one first answer to the question, why do we have textbooks? We have them because they are an essential and definitive building block of all formal education settings. But now let's go to the central question of this video. Do we need textbooks? This question is a far more difficult one to answer. I will try to answer it though by briefly considering three areas: textbooks as teaching and learning materials, textbooks as political decisions, and finally the moral dimension of textbooks. Please bear with me and let's start with looking at textbooks as learning materials. Well, in English language teaching, the formal term for textbooks in the relevant literature is language learning materials. Language learning materials usually refer to textbooks and workbooks, but there are also teachers' books, grammar books, CD-ROMs, or websites with additional materials, and so on and so forth. What do textbooks offer in terms of teaching and learning? What do they contribute? Well, a number of things. The first thing textbooks offer is a selection of language learning tasks that are typically coupled with a series of inputs. So inputs and tasks are really what a typical textbook contains. And these are what the teacher uses to expose learners to new language and engage them in activities of all sorts and types that help them practice and ideally learn the functions and the structures that are appropriate for their level. The second thing that textbooks offer is a syllabus. In other words, the tasks and inputs that we find in textbooks are not randomly presented on the coursebook's pages. They follow a very specific sequence that adheres to a very specific plan. Again, that plan or syllabus follows a very specific set of principles that every textbook subscribes to with regard to teaching, learning, assessment and testing of the structures and functions presented in the textbook. The third thing that textbooks offer is a sense of security for everyone involved. Textbooks are designed and developed by expert authors. They go through a rigorous reviewing process, and every photograph, every icon, every page is selected and laid out with one thing in mind: to reach, in the best possible and most convincing way, the goal that the publishers have explicitly set for them and towards which each textbook is marketed. This means that the teacher is certain that his or her learners follow a specific syllabus and very specific inputs and tasks, each with a particular learning outcome. The learners have specific items to study and look forward to studying. Learners instinctively know they are at school when they are inside a class with their textbooks, right? The parents have a record of their children's progress. They can trace it very easily by referring to, well, their progress in the textbook, in pages. And headmasters or school owners may on occasion use the courseware of a particular publisher to promote their language center. In other words, textbooks are a central part of the whole school experience. So with regard to our question, do we need textbooks? Seeing textbooks as language learning materials, I would argue that they undoubtedly have many things to offer: tasks, inputs, explanations, a theoretical framework, a syllabus and security. And this definitely makes them indispensable in formal education settings. In other words, textbooks are here and are not going anywhere. But this brings us to the second aspect of textbooks: their political dimension. Now, this may surprise some of you, but every decision to use a particular textbook over another one is a political act. By political, I don't mean the things that have to do with government or state affairs or even with politicians. No, by political, I refer to the underlying assumptions about teaching, learning, assessment and testing that come with each textbook. What makes these assumptions political is that they make specific claims about fundamental concerns in English language teaching, such as, for example, the role of the teacher, the role of the learners, the extent to which and ways in which teachers can differentiate instruction to meet the demands of individual learners, the ways in which textbooks meet the goals they set out to achieve at every proficiency level, whether they are primarily testing-oriented or learning-oriented. And of course, everything that has to do specifically with language teaching. For example, how the language skills are perceived, how tasks are structured and implemented, the role that native speakers play in the inputs and tasks, how culture is perceived. Remember the picture of the Big Ben, especially in the textbooks of the 1970s and 1980s. Or remember the photographs accompanying reading inputs, which these days tend to have a specimen from different racial types of people. All these are political, whether we see it or not. Experienced teachers can very quickly discern the type of textbook they have in their hands just by browsing through its pages. Another point that needs to be made in terms of the political dimension of textbooks has to do with the fact that textbooks are industrial products. They are printed materials that are made in order that they are purchased at a certain price. They serve a specific purpose in terms of teaching and learning. But they are also products of marketing that aim at making profit for their publishers. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, except when you think that the same products, textbooks, will be used in teaching contexts that are populated by people, but no two people are the same. Even the same person is different at different times. This is something that everyone knows. We all understand and preach about the importance of meeting the learning needs of every learner. We all put the learner first, in principle. And yet we adopt textbooks and other such products in our classes. All of the above are politically laden decisions. And this brings me to the third and final concern with regard to answering the question, do we need textbooks? It's probably the most difficult one of all and refers to the moral dimension of choosing, adapting and using textbooks. The moral challenge that textbooks pose has to do with everything mentioned so far, of which we are fully aware. It has to do with placing everything on a scale and balancing between what is offered and what is sacrificed. With the fact that textbooks offer informed, graded, ready-made and sleek solutions to teachers, but with the added bonus of often oversimplifying pedagogy and politically coloring key concerns of teaching. What's the bottom line? Well, realistically speaking, we won't be looking at the demise of textbooks anytime soon, for all the reasons that we've seen above. And I'm not entirely convinced that getting rid of textbooks will magically improve education. But teachers need to be cognizant of the role of textbooks, the extent to which they offer opportunities for learning rather than simply preparing learners to sit a high-stakes exam, the washback. Teachers need to look into the underlying assumptions textbooks make about language use, language learning, teaching and assessment. And most of all, teachers need to find ways to adapt textbooks, their activities and even the inputs to the needs and learning profiles of their learners. A textbook's role is to serve learning. It is a tool, a means to an end, and not an end in itself. In English language teaching, we always try to put the learners first, researching the learners' needs and their learning strategies, and with good reason, of course. So we want our classes to be, at best, learner-centered. We have a deep distrust for classes that are fully controlled by the teacher, classes that have the teacher at the forefront of all action, without any acknowledgement of the learner's profile. That's why we detest teacher-centered classes. But think about what is going on in some or even a few of our classes. In many cases, it doesn't really matter where the teacher stands or how they carry themselves. Because in these cases, it's not the teacher who does the teaching. Essentially, it's the textbook, which essentially means that in these situations, we're dealing not with a teacher-centered class, but with a textbook-centered class. So every time I'm asked the question, do we need textbooks? I always respond that I would love if a class was teacher-centered, provided teachers have the skills, the knowledge, but also the autonomy to select, adapt and use textbooks in ways that respond to their learners' true needs and learning profiles. As always, I look forward to communicating with you. Bye for now.